The morning sun poured across the valley like liquid gold, turning the surface of my reservoir into a sheet of glass. From the deck of my cabin, perched on the slope above, I could see the glimmer of the water I had collected over years of careful planning, hard labor, and plenty of money. To most people, it was just a private pond or a small lake. But to me, it was the crown jewel of my property, my own self-made sanctuary. Living outside city limits, I had purchased these 70 acres of land precisely for the independence it promised. I grew vegetables, raised chickens, and built a small dam on the natural stream that ran through the property. Over time, I had reinforced the dam with concrete and proper spillways, turning what was once a seasonal creek into a year-round water source. That reservoir kept my land green, my animals thriving, and my crops productive, even during the worst drought years. But independence always comes at a price. And in my case, the price wore designer sunglasses, carried a clipboard, and answered to the title President of the Homeowners Association. Her name was Karen Whitmore. Karen was the kind of neighbor who believed the entire valley was her personal kingdom. She lived in a massive white mansion with columns, fountains, and a yard so manicured it looked like a golf course. She was wealthy, loud, and endlessly intrusive. I had seen her snoop over fences, measure people's lawns with rulers, and lecture anyone whose mailbox didn't meet HOA standards. For years, I stayed out of her way. My property technically fell within the extended jurisdiction of the HOA, though I had never voted for it and never signed their ridiculous bylaws. Still, Karen insisted that everyone around here must contribute to the neighborhood aesthetic. I had ignored her demands, until one day, she decided to make me her personal project. It started with letters. Dear resident, the first one read in polished cursive, we have noticed that the dam you constructed may be in violation of HOA water use guidelines. Please provide documentation within 10 business days. I tossed it in the trash. My dam predated her HOA rules, and state law recognized my water rights. But Karen was not the kind of person to be ignored. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived, this one with bold red ink. You are being fined $500 for excessive water storage. Additional fines will accrue daily until compliance is achieved. I laughed out loud. Excessive water storage? That wasn't even a thing. You can't own too much water if it's running through your land, and you build legal infrastructure to capture it. But Karen had found some obscure HOA clause, twisted it beyond reason, and decided that my reservoir made me guilty of hoarding water resources. That's when the war began. The fines kept stacking up, each letter more aggressive than the last. I called her bluff at first, figuring she couldn't enforce them. But Karen was relentless. She had the HOA lawyer send official documents. She sent contractors to inspect my dam without permission. She even filed a complaint with the county. When an inspector finally showed up, he looked embarrassed. Listen, he told me, standing at the edge of the reservoir. Your dam is perfectly legal. You've done everything by the book. But the HOA keeps filing complaints. I can't stop them from harassing you. Figures, I muttered. Things escalated when Karen showed up on my porch one afternoon in a wide-brimmed hat and heels that sank into the dirt. You think you're clever, don't you? She sneered. But you can't just hog all this water. It ruins the neighborhood balance. It's my land, my reservoir, and my dam, I said flatly. You don't own the rain. Her eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. The HOA has rules, and I intend to enforce them. You'll either drain that water, or I'll drain your bank account. She stormed off, leaving a cloud of expensive perfume and venom behind her. That was the moment I knew. Karen had declared war, and she wouldn't stop until I fought back. Weeks passed, and the pressure mounted. Karen wasn't content with just fines. She organized meetings where she painted me as a selfish tyrant, hoarding life-giving resources, while others' lawns went brown. She convinced her friends to file complaints about imaginary mosquito infestations from my reservoir. She even started a rumor that my dam was structurally unsound and could flood the whole neighborhood. Meanwhile, she prepared for her grandest event of the year, the Whitmore Garden Party. Every summer, Karen transformed her backyard into an extravagant spectacle. There were silk tents, catered meals, fountains running champagne, and musicians flown in from the city. It was her way of showing off her wealth and cementing her dominance as queen of the HOA. This year's party was even bigger. She had mailed invitations to hundreds of guests, politicians, and even a local news crew. I hadn't planned to attend, of course. But as I watched her guests arrive in shiny black cars, I noticed something. Her estate sat directly below the spillway of my dam. That gave me an idea. Now, let me be clear, I never intended to hurt anyone. But after months of harassment, fines, and trespassing, I figured a little poetic justice was in order. Karen wanted to fine me for owning too much water? Fine. I'd give her more water than she could handle. So on the morning of her party, I walked down to the dam and checked the gates. The reservoir was full from spring rains, the surface shimmering like liquid silver. I opened the secondary spillway just a crack, letting the water surge into the channel that led downhill. By noon, when the party was in full swing, I opened it wider. From my cabin deck, I could hear the faint echo of music drifting up the valley, violins, laughter, clinking glasses. Karen's estate gleamed with white tents and polished tables. Guests in suits and gowns strolled through her elaborate garden, sipping cocktails among the rose bushes. Then came the water. It started as a trickle through the back hedges, soaking the manicured lawn. Guests lifted their shoes, annoyed but not alarmed. Then the flow became a steady stream, rushing across the yard and pooling around the party tents. Within minutes, the band stopped playing, women screamed as their dresses got soaked, and the catering tables collapsed under the surge. From above, it was like watching a slow-motion tidal wave crash through a dollhouse party. Chairs floated, champagne bottles toppled, and Karen herself stood on the patio, shrieking orders no one could follow. By the time I closed the dam, her million-dollar garden looked like a swamp. The aftermath was glorious. Karen tried to sue me, of course, claiming I had intentionally flooded her estate. But the county inspector came back, shook his head, and said, "Natural spillway overflow. Perfectly legal." The HOA tried to triple my fines, but their threats fell flat when I countered with my lawyer and the state water rights documents. In the end, Karen not only lost her case, but also had to pay for repairs out of her own pocket. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who once feared Karen's wrath started laughing behind her back. Her garden party disaster became local legend. People even nicknamed her Queen of the Swamp. As for me, I kept my dam, my reservoir, and my independence. Every time I sit on my deck and watch the water sparkle in the sunlight, I remember the day Karen learned the hard way. You don't mess with a man who controls the water. Because sometimes, the best revenge is just opening the floodgates. The first morning I woke up on my farm, I remember breathing in the crisp air and feeling like I had finally found freedom. After years of living in the city, surrounded by concrete walls and the constant noise of traffic, the open fields and rolling hills were everything I had dreamed of. My farm wasn't huge, just 20 acres, but to me, it felt like a kingdom. I had chickens, a couple of goats, 3 cows, and a big red barn that looked like something from an old postcard. But as I quickly learned, freedom is always fragile, and nothing attracts trouble faster than a homeowners association run by someone who believes they were born to control others. In my case, that someone was Karen Summers, the president of the HOA. At first, Karen came across as polite. She brought me a basket of muffins the week I moved in, and introduced herself with a smile that felt more like a smirk. She asked me what I planned to do with the land, and I told her honestly, I want to grow vegetables, raise animals, and make this a place where I can live off the land. Her face twitched. Well, that's nice. But you should know, our community has standards. I thought she meant things like keeping your grass cut or not leaving junk cars in the driveway. I had no idea that she had a personal vendetta against farm animals, especially goats. The trouble started with a letter taped to my gate. Dear resident, it began in stiff, formal language. The HOA has received multiple complaints regarding your livestock. Farm animals are not in line with community aesthetic guidelines. Please remove them within 14 days to avoid fines. I read the letter twice, then laughed. My land wasn't in the middle of some suburban neighborhood. It was zoned for agriculture. Karen might run her HOA like a petty dictatorship, but she didn't own the county courthouse. My animals weren't going anywhere. I ignored the letter. A week later, Karen herself showed up, clipboard in hand. She strutted across my driveway like she owned it and glared at my goats, who were happily chewing on a patch of weeds. "These creatures are a nuisance," she snapped. "They make noise, they smell, and they ruin the community image." "They're goats," I replied calmly. "That's what goats do. And they're legal here." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see how long that lasts. I run this HOA, and I'll have you fined until you comply." She turned on her heel and left, her heels clacking against the gravel like gunshots. The fines started arriving daily. First $100, then $250, then $500. Each envelope had bold red stamps across the top. Notice of violation. I tossed them all into a drawer and refused to pay. But Karen wasn't satisfied with just fines. She began a smear campaign. At HOA meetings, she told everyone that my goats were dangerous and aggressive. She claimed my chickens carried diseases. She even told neighbors that my cows were polluting the groundwater. Some of the neighbors avoided me after that. Others whispered apologies, saying they didn't want to get on Karen's bad side. It felt like I was being painted as some villain in a story where she was the hero. But I knew the truth. Karen wasn't trying to protect the community. She just couldn't stand that I was independent, that I didn't bow to her rules, and that my farm made her sterile mansion look less impressive. I decided it was time to fight back, not with anger, but with creativity. One evening, as I stood in my barn feeding the animals, I looked around at the twinkling lights I had strung up for fun. The barn smelled of hay and cedar, warm and welcoming. I suddenly thought, this place would make a perfect wedding venue. The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. If Karen wanted to fine me for having animals, fine. I'd turn the barn into something she couldn't touch, a licensed business. Within weeks, I applied for the necessary permits. I cleaned out the barn, built a stage, set up tables and chairs, and installed proper lighting. A friend of mine who worked as a contractor helped me make sure everything met fire codes. Another friend, who was a chef, offered catering. When it was ready, I launched a website, Rustic Dreams Wedding Barn. I posted pictures of the scenic fields, the animals grazing peacefully in the background, and the cozy barn decked out in fairy lights. To my surprise, bookings started rolling in immediately. Couples loved the idea of saying their vows surrounded by nature, with goats bleating softly in the distance. Karen was furious. The first wedding happened on a warm Saturday in May. Cars filled my driveway, music played, and laughter echoed across the fields. The bride looked radiant as she walked down the aisle between rows of hay bales, and the groom had tears in his eyes as he said his vows. Even my chickens seemed to cluck in approval. Karen showed up halfway through, marching down the driveway in a designer dress, waving her clipboard like a sword. "This is a violation," she screamed. "You can't host parties like this. You're disturbing the neighborhood." The bride's mother, a stern woman in pearls, stepped forward. "Excuse me, but this is my daughter's wedding. If you ruin this moment, I'll have you escorted out." Karen's jaw dropped. For once, she had no power. She stomped away, red-faced, while the rest of us celebrated late into the night. Over the next months, my barn became the most popular wedding venue in the county. Word spread fast. Photographers loved the rustic backdrop, caterers loved the space, and guests loved the farm animals wandering around like mascots. One couple even insisted on taking their wedding photos with my goats, who stood proudly in bow ties. Karen's fury grew with each event. She filed noise complaints. She called zoning officials. She even tried to organize a protest outside my gate. But every time she failed, the county inspector told her plainly, "He has all the permits. This is 100% legal." And here's the best part. Not only were my animals safe, but the wedding business made me more money than I ever expected. The very thing Karen tried to destroy became my greatest success. The breaking point came during her own daughter's engagement. Rumor had it that her daughter wanted a rustic wedding but couldn't afford the expensive venues in the city. Desperate, she secretly booked my barn. When Karen found out, she nearly fainted. She stormed into my driveway, shaking with rage. "How dare you? My daughter will not be married in your barn with those filthy animals." Her daughter, standing behind her, looked mortified. "Mom, it's beautiful here. This is what I want." Karen sputtered, turning red. "You will cancel this at once." But her daughter stood firm. For once, she chose her own happiness over her mother's control. And so, on a bright summer day, Karen was forced to sit in the very barn she had tried to shut down, watching her daughter marry the love of her life. She looked miserable the entire time, while everyone else laughed, danced, and celebrated under the twinkling lights. After that, Karen finally backed off. Maybe it was the embarrassment, maybe it was the realization that she couldn't win, but she stopped sending letters and complaints. She retreated into her mansion, and I barely saw her again. Meanwhile, my farm thrived. The wedding business boomed, my animals lived happily, and I became known not as the nuisance neighbor but as the guy who outsmarted the HOA queen. Every time I watch a bride and groom dance under the barn lights, with my goats munching hay in the background, I smile to myself. Because I know that I didn't just win against Karen, I turned her hatred into my greatest triumph. And the best part? The sound of laughter and music from my barn is the sweetest revenge. When I first bought my land, I thought I was buying peace. The rolling acres, the little grove of oak trees, and the wide open skies promised a kind of freedom that's hard to find these days. I built a modest home, raised a big garden, and even restored an old barn that sat crooked near the stream. To me, the land was more than property. It was a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe without being told how to live. But peace is fragile when you live near people who believe rules matter more than rights. That's where the Homeowners Association came in, led by none other than Karen Delaney, the self-proclaimed queen of order. She wore power suits even when walking her dog, carried a clipboard as if it were a crown, and believed every inch of land within 5 miles was under her aesthetic jurisdiction. At first, I stayed off her radar. I kept my lawn trimmed, didn't blast music, and minded my own business. But Karen wasn't satisfied with quiet neighbors. She wanted control, and when she realized I owned 20 acres of undeveloped land, her eyes lit up like a predator spotting prey. One day, she arrived at my door with a smile so rehearsed it looked painted on. "Hello, neighbor," she said sweetly. "I have the most wonderful proposal. The HOA is looking to expand our community amenities, and your land would be perfect for a community park. Walking trails, picnic tables, a playground. It would be such a gift to everyone." I stared at her for a long moment. "My land isn't for sale." Her smile twitched. "Oh, but you don't understand. This would raise property values for everyone, including you. It's really the neighborly thing to do." I shook my head. "Not happening." She left, but her eyes promised this wasn't over. The letters started the following week. At first, they were dressed up in polite language, requests for me to consider selling. Then came the thinly veiled threats, fines for overgrown vegetation, notices about unauthorized structures on my barn, and complaints that my garden was unsightly. I knew it was Karen pulling the strings. Every notice had her fingerprints all over it, nitpicking details no one else cared about. When I ignored them, she escalated. She brought it up at HOA meetings, rallying others with visions of a beautiful park for our children, and painting me as the selfish recluse standing in the way of progress. Soon, neighbors who had once waved at me stopped making eye contact. Some even muttered about me being a land hoarder. Karen was winning the social battle, but she didn't understand. I wasn't about to let anyone take what I had built. Things came to a head when I received a certified letter from the HOA attorney. It declared that my property was being considered for eminent domain seizure. Under the justification of community benefit, I nearly laughed out loud. Eminent domain is a government power, not something an HOA can just claim. They didn't have the authority. But the fact that they were trying told me one thing. Karen was dead serious. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the trees, I decided that if Karen wanted a war, she would get one. But it would be on my terms. First, I made my land less appealing. If she wanted it for a park, I'd make sure it looked like the worst candidate imaginable. I built tall fences around the perimeter, posted private property, no trespassing signs every 50 feet, and installed cameras on poles. I even added motion sensor lights that would flare up if anyone crossed the boundary. Karen called it an eyesore. I called it a fortress. Next, I doubled down on making the land useful to me. I expanded my garden, planted fruit trees, and brought in a small herd of sheep. I wasn't just some guy with empty acreage anymore. I was a farmer with an active agricultural operation. That meant I qualified for special protections under county law. When Karen complained again, the county inspector came out, looked at my land, and told her flatly, "He's using it for agriculture. He's well within his rights." The look on her face was priceless. But she didn't stop. She filed noise complaints when my sheep bleated. She claimed my compost pile was a health hazard. She even accused me of harboring dangerous wildlife, pointing at the harmless barn cats that lounged on my fence posts. Each time, inspectors came out, found nothing wrong, and left shaking their heads. But Karen kept trying, convinced that if she threw enough accusations, one would eventually stick. Then came her boldest move yet. One Saturday afternoon, I heard voices near my oak grove. When I went to investigate, I found Karen and 3 other HOA board members walking my land, tape measures in hand. They were surveying my property without permission. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted. Karen didn't even flinch. "We're assessing the potential park site. This land is wasted on you." I marched right up to them. "You're trespassing. Leave. Now." One of the men muttered, "We have community authority." "No, you don't." I cut him off. "This is private property. I'll call the sheriff." Karen's smirk faltered when she realized I was dead serious. They left in a huff, but I knew then that this was far from finished. That night, I called a lawyer. A good one. Together, we started filing paperwork to protect my property rights. Agricultural use exemptions, nuisance shields, and even a conservation easement that legally bound the land against being repurposed without my consent. It cost money, but it built a wall of law around my land that even the most stubborn HOA couldn't breach. Karen must have sensed she was losing ground because her tactics turned desperate. She started hosting Save the Park rallies, painting signs that read, "Our kids deserve better," and trying to guilt neighbors into supporting her cause. At one point, she even brought a local reporter out to film a segment about the stubborn landowner blocking community progress. I didn't take the bait. I simply showed the reporter my thriving farm, explained my rights, and watched as the story quietly disappeared from the evening news. The breaking point came with her so-called community picnic. Karen decided to stage a symbolic takeover of my land. She and a group of HOA loyalists marched onto my property with picnic baskets, blankets, and kites, declaring it the future site of the community park. Unfortunately for them, I had already anticipated something like this. The sheriff's department had been informed of the trespassing issue, and I had installed enough cameras to prove everything. When I called the sheriff that afternoon, deputies arrived within 20 minutes. They politely but firmly escorted Karen and her crew off my land. Watching her sputter about the people's rights while being led away was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. After that humiliation, the HOA finally backed down. The legal threats dried up, the fines stopped, and Karen vanished from my driveway. She still glared at me from across the neighborhood, but the fire was gone from her crusade. My land was mine, and there wasn't a thing she could do about it. Over time, the neighbors who had once sided with her began to warm back up to me. Some even apologized, admitting they had been swept up in her charm offensive. A few asked if they could buy vegetables from my garden or bring their kids to see the sheep. I welcomed them. I wasn't against community. I was against tyranny disguised as community. Now, when I walk across my fields at sunset, the fences standing tall and the sheep grazing peacefully, I smile. Karen tried to turn my sanctuary into her playground. Instead, I turned it into a fortress she couldn't touch. And the lesson is clear. You can mess with a man's house, maybe even his pride, but you don't mess with his land. Because land is freedom. And freedom, once claimed, is worth defending to the very end. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had found a quiet corner of paradise. The houses were well kept, the streets were lined with trees, and my property backed up to a small wooded area. It wasn't the countryside, but it was close enough. I could have my big garage, my tools, and most importantly, my pickup truck. That truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was the backbone of my work, the machine that hauled lumber for my carpentry jobs, carried tools for weekend projects, and sometimes even pulled my neighbors' cars out of ditches when the snow got too deep. It was a 1985 Ford F-250, built like a tank, painted navy blue, with more dents than chrome but a heart that wouldn't quit. To me, it was family. But to the HOA president, none other than Karen Whitfield, it was an eyesore. Karen was the type of woman who treated the HOA like a throne. She wore pastel blazers, carried a binder thicker than a law book, and spoke as though she were the mayor of the neighborhood. To her, everything had to fit a certain aesthetic. Lawns manicured like golf courses, houses painted in regulation colors, and cars that looked like they came from a dealership showroom. So when she saw my old Ford parked proudly in my driveway, she decided it was a personal insult. The first letter arrived in my mailbox 2 weeks after I moved in. Dear resident, your vehicle is in violation of HOA Policy Section 14.2. Commercial or unsightly vehicles may not be parked in driveways or on the street. Please remove the truck within 7 days to avoid fines. I laughed when I read it. My truck wasn't commercial, it was personal. And as for unsightly, well, that was a matter of opinion. Sure, it had some rust on the bumper and the paint was faded, but it ran like a dream. I ignored the letter. A week later, a second notice arrived, this one with bold red letters. Final warning. The fine was listed as $100, to be applied daily until the offending vehicle was removed. I wasn't about to be bullied. I parked my truck in the same spot, washed it until it gleamed, and even polished the chrome hubcaps. If they thought they could intimidate me, they were wrong. That's when Karen showed up in person. She marched up my driveway in heels, clutching her binder like it was a holy book. Good afternoon, she said in a tone that was anything but good. We need to discuss your truck. I crossed my arms. What about it? It violates community standards, she said. It's old, it's rusting, and it lowers property values. This neighborhood has a certain image to uphold. I smirked. Funny, because I've only gotten compliments from neighbors. Just last week, I helped Jim down the street haul mulch for his garden. Karen sniffed. That may be, but the rules are the rules. Remove it, or the fines will continue. I looked her dead in the eye and said, the truck stays. Her smile vanished. Then this is war. And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. The fines stacked up, letter after letter. By the end of the month, they claimed I owed over $3,000. I tossed every notice into a shoebox, determined not to give them a dime. Karen escalated. She took photos of my truck from every angle, emailed the board daily, and even called it a hazard to children in one meeting. Rumors spread that my truck leaked oil. It didn't, and that it attracted unsavory visitors, whatever that meant. But here's the thing about me. I don't like bullies. And Karen was nothing but a bully with a clipboard. So I decided if she thought one truck was bad, I'd show her what bad really looked like. I called up a few buddies from my old construction crew. They had trucks too, beat-up Chevys, Dodges, and Fords, some newer, some older. I asked if they wanted to park them at my place for a while. They laughed and said, hell yes. The following Saturday, 5 more pickups rolled into my driveway. Big ones, small ones, shiny ones, rusty ones. We lined them up like soldiers on parade, filling every inch of my property. My yard looked like a used truck lot, and I loved it. Neighbors came by to watch, some chuckling, some shaking their heads. But no one complained, except Karen. She nearly had a meltdown when she drove by and saw the lineup. She screeched her car to a halt, jumped out, and started snapping pictures with her phone. This is outrageous, she shouted. You can't do this. Actually, I said calmly, I can. These are all personal vehicles, legally registered, and parked on private property. Nothing in your precious bylaws says how many I can own. Her face turned the color of a tomato. I will take this to court. Go ahead, I said with a grin. I'll bring the whole fleet. The battle dragged on for months. Karen sent lawyers after me, but mine shot them down every time. The HOA threatened liens, but since I paid my dues on time and wasn't breaking any real laws, they had no case. Meanwhile, my truck collection grew. Friends kept lending me their old pickups just to spite Karen. At one point, I had 10 trucks lined up in perfect formation, engines gleaming, horns honking in unison. We even held a neighborhood barbecue in my yard, letting kids climb into the cabs and pretend to drive. The parents loved it. Karen, of course, called the sheriff. But when deputies arrived, they shrugged and said, nothing illegal here. One even asked if he could buy one of the trucks. The turning point came when local news caught wind of the feud. A reporter showed up, camera in hand, and asked me about the truck war. I explained everything. How the HOA tried to bully me, how I fought back, and how my trucks had become a neighborhood attraction. The story went viral. Suddenly, my driveway was famous. People drove from nearby towns just to see the truck guy's house. I even started a YouTube channel where I gave tours of the collection, shared repair tips, and told the saga of Karen versus the pickups. Subscribers poured in by the thousands. Karen, humiliated, retreated. She stopped sending letters, stopped attending meetings, and eventually resigned as HOA president. Rumor has it, she moved to a different T neighborhood, one without trucks. These days, I still have my old Ford parked proudly in the driveway. Most of the other trucks went back to their owners, but a few stayed. They've become part of the neighborhood's identity. Kids wave at me when I drive by, neighbors stop to chat, and even the new HOA president admits, honestly, it's kind of cool. Looking back, I realized Karen gave me a gift. By trying to take away my truck, she gave me a reason to fight, to stand up for myself, and to turn something simple into something legendary. And now, whenever I rev the engine of my Ford and feel the rumble in my chest, I smile. Because I know I didn't just win a fight with the HOA. I turned their rules into my playground. And the best revenge? My truck is still here.